The night before Challenger launched, some of the people closest to the problem were telling NASA not to launch. Not to be careful, not to monitor the situation, not to take another look. Don't launch. And what makes this story so unsettling is that they weren't talking about a hidden danger. They weren't guessing, they weren't raising some theoretical concern. They were talking about a risk they already knew existed, a risk they'd seen before, a risk they thought was about to get worse. Yet less than 24 hours later, Challenger lifted off anyway. In 73 seconds after launch, 7 people were dead. Challenger didn't fail in 73 seconds. It failed long before the countdown ever started. Before we get into the story, if you enjoy these deep dives into real disasters, safety failures, and the moments where a single decision changed everything, hit the thumbs up button. It really helps the channel. And if you haven't already subscribed, please do and turn on all notifications so you don't miss future episodes. Now, let's go back to January 1986. In January of 1986, Challenger wasn't just another shuttle mission. The entire country was paying attention, and for the first time, NASA was sending a teacher into space. Krista McAuliffe had been selected from thousands of applicants as part of the Teacher in Space program. Schools across America planned to watch the launch live. Students were gathering around televisions. The media was covering the mission non-stop. There was excitement, expectation, national attention, and after several delays, everyone wanted to see Challenger finally leave the ground. But while the country was focused on the launch itself, a very different conversation was happening behind the scenes. To understand the disaster, we need to talk about a small piece of rubber, not because it's complicated, but because it's important. Each solid rocket booster on the shuttle used O-rings to create a seal. Their entire job was simple: keep extremely hot gases where they're supposed to be. Because if those gases escaped, nothing good would follow. Now here's the first thing most people don't know. The O-ring issue wasn't discovered after Challenger. NASA and its contractor Morton Thiokol already knew there had been problems with these seals on previous flights. There had been erosion warning signs, evidence that the joints weren't performing the way they were intended to. The danger wasn't new. It had history. And that's what makes the story all the more upsetting, because Challenger wasn't destroyed by a surprise. It was destroyed by a known problem that never fully got resolved. Then the weather became part of the story too. The morning of January 28th was cold. Very cold by Florida standards. Temperatures were expected to be lower than any previous shuttle launch. To most people, that probably doesn't sound like a major concern, but engineers started getting nervous because rubber behaves differently in cold weather. It becomes less flexible, less responsive, less able to do the job it was designed to do. And if the O-rings were already raising concerns, what would happen during the coldest launch in program history? That question would lead to one of the most important meetings in NASA history. The night before the launch, NASA and engineers from Morton Thiokol held a teleconference. The engineers presented their concerns. They discussed the temperatures, they discussed the O-rings, they discussed the lack of data at temperatures this low, and eventually reached a conclusion. Don't launch. Think about that for a second. The people closest to the problem, the people most familiar with the hardware, the people raising the concern, their recommendation was not to launch. And if this were the end of the discussion, there wouldn't be a documentary, but it wasn't the end. It was only the beginning. NASA pushed back, questions were asked, arguments were made, discussions continued. Then something happened that would later become one of the most studied decisions in modern organizational history. Morton Thiokol management went into a private discussion without NASA on the line. The engineers maintained their concerns. Management reached a different conclusion. The recommendation changed. The company that had argued against the launch now approved it. And with that approval, the mission moved forward. Whenever people talk about Challenger, they often focus on the O-rings. But this moment is just as important, because materials don't reverse their own recommendations. People do. Every organization has information moving through layers of decision-making. An observation becomes a report becomes a recommendation becomes a presentation, and a presentation becomes a decision. And sometimes the message changes along the way, like a game of telephone. After the disaster, investigators found that critical decision makers weren't fully aware of key information surrounding engineering concerns and the original recommendation against launch. Think about that. The risk existed, the concern existed, the warning existed, but by the time the final decision was made, the full picture wasn't visible. And when safety information fails to reach the decision intact, the decision itself becomes unreliable. Morning arrived, the launch proceeded. Millions watched, some from their homes, many from classrooms. Families watched proudly. Students watched eagerly. The countdown reached 0 and Challenger lifted off. At first, everything looked normal. The shuttle climbed into the sky, the crowd cheered, the mission appeared to be underway. Then, after 73 seconds, a flash, and suddenly Challenger was gone. 7 astronauts lost their lives. The nation watched in shock. In the aftermath, the Rogers Commission began investigating what happened. The physical cause wasn't difficult to find. The cold temperatures had affected the O-rings. Hot gases escaped from the right solid rocket booster, and those gases triggered a chain of failures that destroyed the vehicle. But investigators didn't stop there, because knowing how Challenger exploded didn't explain why it did. And that's where the commission uncovered those conversations. Communication failures, decision-making failures, risk management failures. A system where critical safety information didn't effectively reach the people responsible for making the final call. The O-ring explains the explosion. It does not explain the launch decision. Before the material failed, communication failed. Risk visibility failed. Organizational learning failed. Known concerns became acceptable concerns. Warning signs became routine, and over time, abnormal conditions started feeling normal. This is what safety professionals call the normalization of deviance. Nothing bad happens, then nothing bad happens again, and eventually people start believing the risk isn't really a risk, until one day, it is. It would be easy to write Challenger off as a space story from the 1980s, but that's not what it is. Every workplace has hazards, deadlines, pressures. Every workplace has people trying to balance schedules, cost, production against safety. And every workplace has moments where someone raises a concern. The question isn't whether those concerns exist. The question is whether they reach decision makers clearly enough to change the outcome. Because the people making the final decision are only as good as the information they're given. And Challenger is what happens when that chain breaks. The engineers said don't launch, but somewhere between the engineers and the launch pad, the message changed. And 73 seconds after liftoff, Challenger was gone. The lesson isn't that organizations need more information. The lesson is that organizations need better ways to make sure that information reaches the people making critical decisions. Because when safety information changes as it moves through a system, the consequences can be enormous, and sometimes they become history. Thanks for watching. If you found the story valuable, please take a second to hit the like button, subscribe, and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any future episodes. And if there's another disaster or safety story you'd like us to cover, let us know in the comments. Thanks again for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.